guys, it's Courtney. Today I'm going to be creating a card using the Winter Anemone stamp set as well as the Joy Noel wreath die set, both by Honeybee Stamps. And I have a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock here that I have cut down with a large stitched square die, and I'm using my Misty. It's best to use the stamp positioner here, but you can do this with just an acrylic block and just eyeball it. So I'm arranging my first image here, which is one of the holly leaves. I'm going to go ahead and stamp that out with Blackout ink by Ink on 3. Then I'm going to go ahead and rotate my card panel 45 degrees, stamp it again, rotate that panel again, stamp it again, and rotate it another 45 degrees and stamp that once again. It's kind of like the wreath builder, but I'm just doing this on a square panel so you don't have to worry about any template. So I have 2 pieces of the full stick Post-it note tape here, and I'm going to stamp this on the top part here and cut through 2. That way, with one cut, I get 2 masks. Usually the second one isn't perfect, but I'm not doing any ink blending or creating any kind of background here, so I'm not worried about my masks being perfect. But I'm going to go ahead and line up the next leaf here wherever I want this to be. Again, I'm going to go ahead and stamp this with my Blackout ink. Rotate my card panel 45 degrees each and every time and stamp that again. I did end up masking out all of my holly leaves, and I'm going to go ahead and mask these next 2 leaves, or next 4 leaves, I should say, with that same masking paper. You will want to keep all of your masks in place for this entire time. So it's going to be kind of hard to see what the finished result is going to be until all of your stamping is complete. So again, I'm going to go ahead and cut out both of those masks 2 at a time, just like I did before. Then I am going to take another one of the leaves, again, position that to wherever I want that to be, stamp that down 4 times, rotating my card panel 45 degrees each and every time. Now, you don't necessarily have to create a square card with this. I just figured it was the easiest, but you can create a square panel and just adhere that to an A2 size card or an A7 size card, whatever size card you typically make or want to make. And it will just be a panel. You could pop this up on top of a regular size card base. But in this case, I just kept it square, kept it nice and simple. So I'm going to go ahead and line up these last masks here, and then I'm going to take the other holly leaf from that stamp set and position that in that little gap that I have there. And then I am going to stamp that down once again. However, I'm not going to bother to mask this out because this is pretty much the last larger image that I'm using. And for this little sprig, which is totally optional, I just figured I would want something other than just a bunch of greens. I'm just going to place this down in a place where my masks are. So I'm not stamping over that image that is not masked. You can certainly mask out that last image, but again, I just am lazy and I just didn't feel the need. So I'm going to go ahead and stamp this little sprig here 4 times, again, rotating that card panel 45 degrees each and every time. So once all of my stamping was done, I can go ahead and remove all of my masks. Now the Post-it notes are not as sticky as regular masking paper, so they come up pretty easy, but I like to use the tip of my scissors just to kind of get them started so that I don't tear my paper as I'm removing these. And once that's done, we are going to go ahead and cut out one of the bows from the Joy Noel wreath die set. Now we're going to move on to the Copic coloring, and I'm not going to show you all of this because it was a little repetitive. So I'm going to start off with my first green combination, and I'm going to color these 2 leaves that are pretty much the same, just a little bit different in size. And I'm just adding a little bit of shading where this is kind of hanging underneath that holly leaf. And also there's some indentations within these leaves, and I'm just creating little V's with my darkest color, and then each and every time I'm just extending these little V's out. And this is what's really going to give you some texture to this leaf. Going to pretty much do the same thing with this larger one. It's basically the same shape. I always start off with my lightest color to map out those darkest areas and also to get that paper saturated. That way my colors will really blend nicely together. Then I'll jump into the darkest color, the 2 midtones, and I'll finish back off with that lightest color that we started with. So I went ahead and colored all of those leaves the same way with the same color combination. And for the holly leaves, I'm going to bring out a different green combination. And these are kind of curved. So I want to have my shading be a little bit different with these. So I'm going to, again, start off with that lightest color to map out those darkest areas and to get the paper saturated. But I'm going to be adding shading to the bottom as well as the tip of these leaves. And that way this will kind of give it a curved look. This one is kind of curved and bent, so I'm just adding a little bit more shading to the one side, and then I'm just going to extend that out with the G46, the G24, and then finish off with that lightest color that we started with, which is the G21, for pretty much just the middle and off to the right-hand side. So once that was, all my leaves were colored, for these little berries, or I don't even know if they're berries, but we're going to call them berries, I'm going to go in with a R46, which is actually my darkest mid-tone red, and I'm just putting a dot. That's all. In order to get into teeny tiny areas like this, you want to make sure that your marker is straight up and down and just dab the very tip of the marker right where you want that color to be. These are really, really tiny. So obviously I'm not going to do any shading, but this way I'm able to stay in those lines, paying attention to the fact that this is alcohol ink and it does spread slightly. So moving on to this little bow here, I'm going to add a little bit of Tombow Mono Multi-Glue to the back of it and smear that around with my finger. Let that dry, and then I'm going to position this onto a scrap piece of paper just so it doesn't move around as I'm doing my coloring. Now there's no embossed lines on this, so I'm going to have to create some shape. I am going to start off with my lightest color, and all I'm really doing is drawing in the lines for the different parts of this bow. Then I'm going to go in with my darkest color and add my shading. So my shading is going to be where the bow is actually bunched together, and I'm using some flicking motions, and I'm also creating a shadow where one part of the bow is over another. So the part that's underneath it is going to be a little bit darker and have a little bit more shading. For the two pieces of ribbon that are hanging down, I'm just going to add a little bit of shading where that's kind of tucked behind the bow itself and a little bit towards the center, a little bit more than the outside. Blending these areas out a little bit with that R46, which is that darkest mid-tone color. And for the center portion of the bow, I'm just going to add a little bit of shading on the top and the bottom. And you'll notice that I didn't use my darkest color for this. So I'm just adding shading starting with that darkest mid-tone. Every dark area or every shadow area doesn't necessarily have to be with your darkest color. So moving on to the R24, and then I'm going to finish off with that R22. And while this is on scrap paper, it looks a little bit funny because you kind of see those scribble lines on the scrap paper. But once you remove this, you'll see that it actually looks like a bow. I have some white edges because it's kind of hard to tell on that scrap paper. So I'm just going to take my R22 and kind of fill in any of those white areas. And next we are going to assemble the card. So I have another panel of the Nina Solar White that's cut just a little bit larger than my main panel, but I want this to be red, but I want my reds to all match. So I'm going to bring back out that R46 and I'm just going to color in all four sides of this panel here. That way it'll look like I used red cardstock that perfectly matches all of the reds that I have in the card. Going to go ahead and use my Tombow Mono Multi-Glue. I prefer to use wet glue because I never can seem to line things up correctly. And this gives me a couple of seconds to move things around if I need to. I'm going to go ahead and layer that on that red panel and then layer this onto a square card. And this is a 5x5 card base. So next we are going to go ahead and move on to the sentiment. Again, I want my sentiment strips to match everything else. I'm going to use the winter stamp set, also by Honeybee Stamps. So I'm taking another scrap piece of Nina Solar White, going to bring back out that R46 marker and just scribble on some of that color so that my sentiment strips will match all of the other reds that are in the card. Going to go ahead and treat that with my anti-static tool, and I lined up the two sentiments that I'm going to be using here and pop those onto an acrylic block, stamping that with clear embossing ink by Simon Says Stamp. I'll sprinkle on some white embossing powder and heat set that with my heat gun. Now, whenever you're heat setting anything, you want to make sure that your heat gun is heated up before bringing that to the paper. For a small little area like this, it won't matter all that much, but if you are heating a large area or a background on a card, making sure that your heat gun is totally heated up before bringing that to the paper will minimize the amount of warping. So bringing up my tonic trimmer, and I'm just going to cut this into a sentiment strip. I wasn't sure if I was going to leave it all as one, but ended up deciding to cut this into 2 separate strips, and I'm just using my scissors there to try to cut this as straight as I can. Next, I went ahead and used some Scotch foam tape to pop up the 2 sentiment strips as well as this little bow. And I'm going to place this on the bottom, but you can certainly put this on the top portion of your wreath if that is what you choose. I did add a whole lot of shimmer to the bow with a Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen. If you don't get enough shimmer from a shimmer pen, just wait a couple of seconds until it dries and just keep going over it. And the more times you go over it, the more shimmer you'll get. I finished off with some enamel accents by Ranger, and I'm creating pretty big dots here for my little berries, and that's why I didn't use Nuvo drops. Nuvo drops, for me anyway, and maybe it's something I'm doing wrong, but if I make really, really big areas or big dots, sometimes they crack, so I prefer to use the enamel accents. But that is it. That is the card for today, guys. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and have a great day.